How's it going, guys? So in today's video, what we're going to be going over is a request I got in one of my previous video comments. Someone requested that I show my entire process from start to finish on doing slate coasters. So that's what we're going to do here today. With that being said, I want to say thank you to all the people that have subscribed to the channel, enjoyed my content, and continue to enjoy my content. We just hit a good milestone. I now have 600 subscribers. If you haven't by now, go ahead and subscribe. I do plan to keep making these videos and giving some good content so that way everyone can elevate their skills in this laser engraving industry. Again, I appreciate everybody, and let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so I'm going to go ahead and show you the first thing I do whenever I am going to laser engrave on slate. In most cases, when you get your slate and it has been shipped, sometimes there are blemishes on the slate due to rubbing other pieces of slate in the shipping process. So what I like to do is I just take a wet paper towel with water and I just wipe the slate, and I try to go with the grain as much as possible. Slate's a little difficult to go with the grain because there's so many different grooves and textures to it, but that's all I do. I wipe it down to make sure that I have a nice surface that I'm going to be laser engraving. Now, what I also like to do is after I wet it down with a wet paper towel, I just take a dry one and I wipe it as well, just to make sure I remove all of those little paper towel fibers. And you can see that this one has dried pretty quick. The next thing I do is I take a digital caliper, I set it to millimeters, and then I measure the surface that I will be engraving on. Now for this one, I don't like to go on the edges for this particular image. In most cases, I will stretch the image a little bit further past the actual slate, so that way the image comes out really nice. And this can be with any image, but for this video, for this particular reason, I'm going to be just doing an animal on here, and I want it to be inside of the edges. I don't want it to go over the edges into the nooks and crannies. I want it to be just on the surface. So I measure from the edge where it starts and to the other edge. And as you can see, this area that I'm measuring is 83.7 millimeters. Now, I will jot this down on a piece of paper, so that way I already have this measurement ready to input into the software for this image getting done. All right, so from the home screen on your laser engraving for the Lubin software, first thing I do is I select my image. Next, I know that the size of the slate coaster is 83.7 millimeters wide and tall based on using my digital caliper. So in order for me to ensure that this image goes on the coaster properly, I will change the size to slightly less than the measurement I had grabbed. So instead of doing 83.7, I will end up doing 80 millimeters. Since my size for width and height is locked, they both match at 80 millimeters. Next, because we have this black area around the image that we're working to engrave, I will invert this image. I invert this image, that way all of the black becomes white and all of the light areas on the image become black, and that is your actual part that's going to be laser engraved. From here, I click next, I select my object, and then I create a toolpath. For my toolpath, I like to do dot field engraving. I keep the method as fill. I keep my movement mode at dot. The fill interval, also I like to keep at 0.14 for these smaller images. My jog speed will be increased from 3000 to 4000, and my power will also be increased from 55% to 80%. Click save. Now that I've prepped all of the process, I click generate G-code and preview. It's telling me that this is a 16-minute job. And this is the image that will be engraved onto the slate coaster. Next, I'll click export, export to G-code, bring it to my flash drive, and I'll just name this Bear Coaster, and then it's saved. Next, I'll move on to the machine side. Now I try to place the coaster on the center of my work platform. If I was doing multiple of these or a set, what I actually have is I have a wooden template that has these coaster sizes cut out, and on my software I have the circle or squares placed in a certain area that aligns with my template. That way I can take the image, drag it inside of my working space, and I'm able to produce a set at one run. But for today's purposes, I'm just doing one to give a good idea of how to get these laser engraved slate coasters done. So again, just one. I try to place it center of my working platform, and I will move my laser to meet and calibrate above the slate. Alright, so what I do here on my control module is I hit start, go to my USB. I have multiple files laid out for specific things that I do with this machine, but for today's purpose of the video, I will select laser, I will select the Bear Coaster, I select next. Now the machine will move to its home position and try to center itself. From here, I use my calibration target and I set it on top of the slate coaster, and then I start moving the machine manually to position it in an area that works best. I typically start off with moving at 100mm increments, and since my machine home is center above the platform, most times I just have to drop this Z-axis down to meet the calibration target, and then I do my fine tune X and Y once I get it calibrated above the target. I always start off with doing 300mm and then I move to 10. I'll stop it at 9, and now I'll get in the machine and I'll show you how I get it calibrated to be perfectly laser engraved. Alright, so now that I've gotten the laser positioned very close to calibration target, now I move on my control module to 1mm movements, and I again, using the Z-axis, drop it down until it gets extremely tight to the calibration target. What you're looking for is being able to slightly move it with a little pressure from the tool head. So right there, it is very tight. So what I do is I'll raise it up 1 and I'll leave it just like that. Now I just hit next, confirm that the laser will be turned on, and now I will run a boundary and then again fine tune the position of my laser to make sure that my image is inside of the slate coaster. So I'll go ahead, confirm that tool head will be running, and I'll run a boundary. If you noticed, the laser closest to the camera actually went over the edges. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do fine-tune adjustments to move it in the direction to get it within the coaster. And I'll run boundary again. I feel confident that it will be inside the coaster exactly how I want it to. So from here, all I do is just start the job. Alright, so the laser engraving is finished. This is what it looks like as is. Now what I like to do is I take a wet paper towel and give it a nice pat, so that way I can see what it will look like when I seal it with a matte clear coat. As you can tell, the image quality is really good. After roughly 5 minutes or so, after I wipe the coaster down with a wet paper towel, it is now dry. And all I do here for my final step is I use a Rust-Oleum clear matte, and I give it 2 light coats, and I let that dry for the first coat. Probably takes 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll come back with a second coat and it'll be finished. All right, it has been about 10-15 minutes. Now I'm going to apply the second and final coat to the coaster. And that's it. I'll give this one 15-20 minutes. Once it dries, I'll show you the final result. All right, and here's the end result. You can see all the fine detail to it. And I purposely selected this image because it kind of looks like he's standing on a cliff, and it gives it a nice feel to the image. Hopefully this video has helped you, and if you haven't by now, subscribe to the channel. I plan to do a bunch more of these videos and tips and tricks and tutorials to some of this work. Give this video a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I do make these images, and I typically put them on my Etsy shop, and I'll leave a link for that below in the description of the video. As always, keep crafting.